I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
We shall always come together in a circle to hear and tell of deeds good and brave. Knights of the Round Table.
When it comes to fantasy and the greatest stories ever told, it doesn't get more classic than the story of King Arthur and Camelot. The story of Arthur, Lancelot, and Merlin has been part of our storytelling history for so long that many believe that Arthur actually existed and that Camelot was real. Within the realms of film, the story has been adapted numerous times over the years, but the one considered the best of all these adaptations was brought to life in 1981 by filmmaker John Boorman, along with those most famous of knights being played by actors who had become legends in their own right over the following decades. In this episode of Fantasizing About Fantasy Films, we're going back to the source of some of our greatest stories as we look at the classic Excalibur. Excalibur was the passion project of director John Boorman. Boorman not only directed the film, but wrote and produced it as well. He tried getting the film made back in the late 60s, but no one would back the project, thinking it was too much of a risk and too expensive. In fact, Boorman was offered instead a chance to make a live-action adaptation of Lord of the Rings, but that didn't happen either, unfortunately. After watching Excalibur, you can only imagine what Boorman would have done with it. Instead, Lord of the Rings would get an animated version in 1978, directed by Ralph Bakshi, and Boorman would go on to direct some wide-ranging projects over the coming years, including Deliverance, Zardoz, and Exorcist II: The Heretic. Deliverance would be nominated for multiple Oscars in 1972, and Exorcist II would not be. But Boorman showed he could handle a budget and make some impressive films, and so Orion Pictures, along with Warner Brothers, gave him the green light. This can actually be considered a pun if you've watched the film, and a budget of $11 million to make his longed-for epic.
You will swear by your true kingship to grant me what I wish.
Boorman's version of the King Arthur myth would not be a family-friendly event and would also not be filled with perfect heroes or clean battles. It would be gritty, filled with sex and violence, and wouldn't shy away from a story that dealt with man's failings and weakness and the hope to do better and rise above them. It would set itself apart from the musical stylings of Camelot, the slapstick of Monty Python and the Holy Grail,
Look! Just a flesh wound.
or the Disney fare of The Sword and the Stone. Excalibur would be magical, yes, but it would also have a healthy dose of blood and gore, being almost hedonistic and manic in its portrayal of Arthur, Merlin, and the knights and ladies of Camelot. Excalibur was filmed in Ireland, actually quite nearby where John Boorman lived. The film would actually put Ireland's film and acting community on the map due to the casting of, at the time, not so well-known Irish actors in their first major movie roles, such as Ciarán Hinds, Gabriel Byrne, and Liam Neeson. Although not Irish, Patrick Stewart would count this film as his first major film project as well. Excalibur does a great job in covering all aspects of the Arthurian myth by staying true to the core of the story while changing up certain aspects.
The Lady of the Lake.
Uther still uses magic to sate his lust for another man's wife and pays the price for his desire. Merlin takes Arthur to be raised without knowing who his father is. Arthur eventually finds Excalibur and in a hilarious act of chance pulls it from the stone it is embedded in. Guinevere and Lancelot have their tragic romance, and Arthur fathers an abomination with his half-sister Morgana. This version manages to mix some things though, such as the death of Arthur tales, but here Percival comes to the fore as the knight who is by Arthur's side at the end of his journey. Boorman's Excalibur didn't really look like anything that had come before it when it came to the story of Arthur. The film had an otherworldly quality about it, like a fairy tale book come to life. Boorman used lighting in a way that added another layer to the scenes. For example, whenever magic, or specifically the magic that gives Excalibur its power, is at play, there's always a green light reflected either on the armor of the knights or somewhere in the scene. When you watch the film, keep an eye out for it. As for the knights themselves, the armor they wear is also used to enhance the story. Arthur and his knights, during the wedding scenes and when the heyday of Camelot is happening, it shines with an almost unworldly sheen, like warrior angels. This shows the purity of Arthur and his men, the ideal. But as the film progresses and we see the ravages of evil taking hold, this happens with Uther too, the armor becomes dirty and broken. Within the scenes of Percival finding the Grail at last, we see him shed his armor, divesting himself of the taint of Morgana and Mordred's evil and the blight that settled on the throne. The truth of the Grail sets him free, and as Merlin said, the most important part of being a knight is truth. Imagery, as you can tell, is important within the film, and Boorman uses a lot of it. Christian imagery is of course prevalent as well, but not only with the Grail part of the story, but with Arthur being a king of man, being betrayed by his closest follower, seemingly dying to rise again. The return of the king is mentioned, just like the return of Christ is within the pages of the Bible.
Lancelot carried my honor, and Guinevere my guilt. Mordred bore my sins. My knights have fought my causes. Now, my brother, I shall be king.
There's also the scene of Lancelot and Guinevere making love in the forest, both naked and surrounded by a seemingly pure nature. It's very reminiscent of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but their sin of betraying Arthur happens, and when they see Excalibur there between them, the hilt looking very much like a cross at that point, they are immediately ashamed and terrified, just like Adam and Eve. Guinevere chooses a life of piety as a nun to make up for her sin, keeping Excalibur with her as a reminder of true faith and love, which she gives back to Arthur. During that scene, Arthur seemingly talks about reincarnation, of coming back in another life where they can be together, and he isn't the king.
That in the hereafter of our lives, when I owe no more to the future, can be just a man, that we may meet, and you'll come to me.
This could be a nod to the temptation of Christ that would have been offered, of having a normal life and not having to sacrifice himself for his people. Again, there's a lot going on in this movie. Merlin speaks about the dragon, and within the telling of that, we discover the dragon he's speaking about is actually the world itself.
It is everywhere. It is everything. Its scales glisten in the bark of trees. Its roar is heard in the wind, and its forked tongue strikes like...
That's the dragon you must fight and tame in order to win. It's an apt metaphor. Merlin himself is an interesting character in this, as Boorman made a point of making the film be a fable about the rise of Christianity and the loss of the pagan ways like Merlin's magic, much like Dragon Slayer did the same year. Merlin is more than accepting of his fate and realizes his power is fading because of the time of man.
The days of our kind are numbered. The one god comes to drive out the many gods.
But before he leaves this world for one of the many others that abound, he wants to ensure a good man is king. He believes in man, even if man doesn't believe in him. For all intents and purposes, Arthur is as much his son as Uther's. So yes, there's a bit of a god metaphor there as well. That dying off of magic also leaves a lot of brutal realism at the heart of this movie. There's not nearly as much magic as you'd expect in this film, and that's fine, because it doesn't need it to tell the story. The story here is key, not massively flashy effects. It still has some beautiful shots though, and I truly love Merlin's lair. But again, back to the brutal realism. The fight scenes aren't pretty, and that's because armor is not fun to fight in. Even with these suits having been made out of aluminum, they were still unwieldy, just like armor would be. So it's not fast and slick like, say, a lightsaber battle. These are big axes, heavy swords, and it's all pretty much on top of mud. The final fights are gory, with arms being hacked off and lots of red. This also includes Morgana's Tree of Death, where we see corpses with meat still on the bone being picked and eyeballs being pecked out. Excalibur feels very much like a theatrical production or play, no doubt due in part to the actors involved, who were all very accomplished theater actors. This includes Nicol Williamson, who played Merlin, who was also a perfect wizard. Changeable, kind, dangerous, creepy, and terribly vengeful. Williamson was fantastic in the role. He was no stranger to medieval fare, having played Little John a few years prior in the bittersweet film Robin and Marian. He followed that up with a turn as another literary legend as Sherlock Holmes in the star-packed The 7% Solution, opposite Sir Laurence Olivier as Professor Moriarty. His last film appearance would be in Spawn in 1997 as Cagliostro, a medieval knight who helped Spawn learn his powers. Rather perfect. He passed away in 2011. Boorman cast him opposite the amazing Helen Mirren, who played Morgana, due to a stage version of Macbeth that they had both been in and hadn't got a great time together on. He felt this friction added to the heated rivalry between the characters, and he was right. Mirren was stunning as Morgana, and brought the seductive evil of the character to life. But there was also a level of Morgana that was understandable. She was a woman in a world ran by men, and she'd never be allowed to rule herself, even if she was her father's firstborn. Morgana was spurned by Merlin for being too ambitious, and she's not happy about it. Mirren and Liam Neeson wound up in a relationship after meeting in the film for a number of years. Since then, she has gone on to super fame as one of modern cinema's greatest actresses, with roles in both TV and film as well on the stage. She's the only actress to play both Queen Elizabeth I and II. Nigel Terry plays Arthur, and what's insane with his casting is that he plays Arthur from a teenager through his entire life, and he was in his early 30s at the time the film was shot. He's a bit over the top as Arthur at the beginning, but we're supposed to see him as a boy who's humble and has no idea he's royalty. Terry took the role of Arthur and cemented it as his with this film. Whenever someone imagines King Arthur, the image inevitably looks like Nigel Terry. Terry would actually do quite a lot of television work before passing in 2015 at the relatively young age of 69 from emphysema. This would include roles in Highlander the series and also the Doctor Who episode The Doctor's Daughter. The one series I remember him for and loved, and is again quite appropriate, is as the head of the Grey clan in the medieval family drama Covington Cross that aired on ABC in 1992 for a whole 13 episodes. It co-starred the late Glenn Quinn, Ione Skye, and Jonathan Firth as his rather disobedient children, and a number of guest stars, including Greg Weiss, Julian Fellows, and Alex Kingston. John Boorman has had an interesting career and is still creating himself. After Excalibur, he continued making movies, directing, writing, and producing the film The Tailor of Panama in 2001 with star Pierce Brosnan, who actually had auditioned for Excalibur but didn't make the cut at the time. Boorman wrote a novel in 2016 that takes place in the land of movie making called Crime of Passion. Excalibur is a classic of a classic. This single film really launched the movie careers of some of the greatest actors. Let me list those names again. Patrick Stewart, Ciarán Hinds, Gabriel Byrne, Liam Neeson, and they aren't even the leads. The film was originally supposed to be around 3 hours long. When it was released, it was just over 140 minutes, and it was slapped with an R rating in the US. There was actually a PG version which cut the film down to 119 minutes, but most theaters stuck with the R-rated version. Funnily enough, HBO showed both versions when it hit cable, PG in the daytime and R at night. Home video and cable were the place many fans would catch this one, as it was in the 80s. The music was also a memorable part of the film's history, as it used compositions from Richard Wagner and Carl Orff, but also Trevor Jones, who would score numerous other projects over the years, but would actually return to the land of Arthur by creating the music for the NBC Merlin miniseries starring Sam Neill in 1998. Excalibur is a perfect example of what the fantasy genre can be. It's beautiful metaphor and legend, myth and mankind combined. It takes the story of King Arthur and makes it real and brutally honest. At its heart, it is a story that's hopeful and shows us men doing what all men should, trying to be noble and rise above, to know when to use the sword and when not to, and to see we're all connected to the world and with our actions to each other, and they have consequences. Thank you for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our JoBlo Videos channel. Tell your friends who like this sort of content and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company and we appreciate all of your support.